Take your seats. We have to start the session. Good morning to all of you. Dear hosts and honored guests, I am very pleased to welcome you to the session 2 of the OSCPA Autumn Meeting 2023, rightly titled Corruption as a Fundamental Threat to Peace and Security. I want to extend my warmest appreciations to the Armenian Parliament for hosting OSCPA Autumn Meeting and giving us the opportunity to hold this session. I also wish to thank our International Secretariat for the support. We are very honored to have an excellent list of prominent guest speakers today with us, who will elaborate the work of their institutions in fighting corruption. I am delighted to introduce our panel of guest speakers, Mrs. Alexandra Habershon from the World Bank, Washington, Mrs. Mariam Kalstian from the Armenian Corruption Prevention Commission, and Mr. Konstantin Vachelasvili from the OSCE ODIHR. I'm really happy we are 3 women on this panel today. I have to add this, yes. As the OSCPA Special Representative on Fighting Corruption, I would like to say a few words regarding corruption as a fundamental threat to peace and security. We have discussed time and again how the OSCE has a comprehensive approach to security encompassing 3 dimensions: the politico-military, the economic, and the human dimension. Corruption is indeed a fundamental threat to all 3 of these aspects. It undermines state legitimacy, and for me, this is the #1 in democracies. Corruption erodes the trust of the people to us, the politicians. It erodes trust to institutions because they are seen as a vehicle for private gain of those who pull the strings, not as a vehicle for service. Corruption also undermines state capacity. It is diverting resources to serve the private interests of the few at the expenses of the many. It is hampering, in reality, the resilience and the potential of our economies. Health, education, and infrastructure can suffer by less than optimal decisions taken by corrupt officials. The security and defense sectors are no exception either. There are examples where the influence of private interests over public policy is so disproportionate that it completely derails action in critical areas. Corruption is also exacerbating inequalities among different groups in society, especially the poor and marginalized. And this is exactly the kind of situation that provides fertile ground for foreign actors to interfere to promote their own agenda, or for terrorist groups to recruit supporters. And I will not shy away from mentioning my own country's shortcomings because this is a recipe for failure. This week, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists has unveiled some new information that very few private, legal, and accounting offices in Cyprus might have helped Russian oligarchs evade sanctions. So the Cypriot citizen was paying high economic and diplomatic costs as a result of the sanctions, while some extremely rich lawyers and accountants were helping oligarchs evade them. This is a telling example of how corruption undercuts state aims, even foreign policy. Grand corruption is particularly dangerous as it leads to state capture. This is when high-level officials are able to use their control over their legislative and regulatory powers to legalize their activities or to weaken oversight and enforcement. They can, at times, interfere directly with the justice system and with national parliaments as well. They use their influence to evade political accountability and to evade prosecution, to even evade exposure from the media. So, what can be done? Is it perhaps an issue of mentality? No. Democratic institutions and processes must provide checks and balances on the power that public officials hold and on how they are using that power. And parliaments are an integral part of the system of checks and balances. We must ensure accountability. Our own accountability will not just happen. It is initiated and sustained by effective processes. As parliamentarians, we can be faced with dilemmas. Sometimes corruption may seem to be coming from friendly political spaces. We must be able to navigate this process. We can't put party discipline above transparency. We can't weaken our accountability standards if we fear they will harm political friends or allies just to score cheap political points, because this too is unethical. And this is not a theoretical discussion. There are many practical measures to take. We can make sure that committees controlling public expenditures are chaired by the opposition. We can make sure that whistleblowers and journalists are well protected. We can make sure that judicial processes are free from interferences, but that there is accountability for their choices as well. We must make sure that full transparency related to the beneficial owners of private companies is guaranteed. We must protect and support those who expose corruption, and we must enhance international cooperation and assistance. Combating corruption is an investment to growth, to democracy, and ultimately to security. Now, the perspective from the World Bank, the ODIHR, and Armenia will provide useful insight into these matters. Our first guest speaker today is Mrs. Alexandra Habershon, Program Manager, Global Lead, Anti-Corruption Governance Global Practice in the World Bank. Since 2011, Alexandra has coordinated the activities of the World Bank Group's International Corruption Hunters Alliance, has designed and delivered anti-corruption training programs and workshops, and coordinated special research projects. Her most recent policy and technical research has focused on whistleblower reporting mechanisms and protections, and the development of data mining methodologies to detect and deter corrupt practices in public contracting and development financing. She has operational experience in Latin America, Africa, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. Dear Alexandra, thank you for accepting our invitation and coming from USA to Yerevan to share your insight with OSCPA delegates. I'm eager to hear your perspective on fighting corruption and learn more about the activities of the World Bank on this matter. The floor is yours.
both. Thank you very much. Thank you, Eleni, for the introduction, and thank you to the OSCPA for the invitation. It really is an honor to be with you today and to share with you a little bit of the perspective on fighting corruption from the World Bank. Just make sure the slides are there. When the World Bank asks key stakeholders in the countries where we work, what is most likely to contribute to the failure of economic and social reform, I think everyone in the room here might not be surprised to hear that the top answer is corruption. When we share that information in other settings, it often causes surprise. But that is, in fact, the top reason why key stakeholders think that economic and social reforms are likely to fail. We typically associate corruption with financial cost. As you just heard from Irene, it is not only financial, obviously. We worry about corruption because it undermines our ability to achieve development objectives, and it undermines results in education, in health, all human capital outcomes. It dissuades foreign investment, and weakens the functioning and inclusiveness of markets. It undermines gender inclusion. And two, I think, areas of really important focus for the World Bank today. It will undermine our response to climate change, and it exacerbates conflict. And that is the focus of today's discussion. So I'm going to say a little bit more about the work that the World Bank does in the context of corruption and conflict. There's a lot of research now in this space. We have evidence that shows that corruption is a driver of conflict and can exacerbate fragility. Why does it do that? How does it do that? How does corruption drive conflict? Well, it undermines the capacity of institutions to deliver basic services, to respond to shocks, to absorb shocks, and to provide security. As a result, corruption also undermines the perception that governments are serving all communities and groups equally and inclusively, and thereby it damages trust in institutions. Therefore, addressing corruption should be at the heart of peace and reconstruction efforts. Something else that we've learned, and that the research has shown from conflicts around the world, that a short-term emphasis on stability in peace settlements can overlook the risks posed by corruption. It is a compromise often that will cost a lot more in the long term. It can prolong conflict, and it will undermine institutions or state building in the long term. Crucially, corruption can also heighten the risk that armed groups and criminal networks will exploit the situations of conflict, and this can also make conflict last longer. And the speed and the scale of investments in reconstruction themselves present new and heightened risks for corruption. This is critically important in all parts of the world where vast increases in foreign aid are being put towards reconstruction efforts. Something else that we've learned from years of experience is that the sequencing and the prioritization of anti-corruption reforms will vary by country and situation. So what do we do to address this problem? Well, it does depend very much on the local context, but there are a lot of tools that we have increasing evidence for that work, and the question then is which tools to use in which settings. On this slide you can see an overview of the World Bank approach to fighting corruption. We're not suggesting that all of these tools are necessary all at once everywhere. I think there needs to be a really careful discussion in every setting as to what the reform opportunities are and what the reform priorities should be. But the emphasis in the World Bank, there's a renewed emphasis in our work on anti-corruption to address the enablers of corruption, I'll say a bit more about that in a second, and to build trust in institutions. So the pillars of our approach, on the one hand, is to reduce the enablers of corruption, the vulnerabilities to corruption and the illicit financial flows generated from the proceeds of corruption. To do that, we undertake national risk assessments for anti-money laundering and the financing of terrorism. We also look at the links between tax and financial crime, tax systems and financial crime. We help governments recover the proceeds of corruption, stolen assets. The Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative is a joint initiative of the World Bank and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. And perhaps one of the most important areas of both policy reform and technical implementation that we're seeing internationally is the adoption of beneficial ownership disclosure requirements. The World Bank is working with countries around the world in setting up beneficial ownership registers, whether that be within the National Corporate Registry, within the electronic procurement system, or through the Tax Administration Authority for access by law enforcement. Another pillar of the work that we do at the World Bank in fighting corruption is to strengthen accountability institutions and the rule of law. This means building institutions, national anti-corruption authorities, and the tools that we use to promote accountability in public administration. So income and asset disclosure systems and whistleblower protections, among the many others that are possible. We're also working with supreme audit institutions to help them digitize and automate the detection of risk and to be able to conduct real-time audit, not just ex-post audit of risk. We are working with justice systems to help them modernize through the digitization of procedures, the publication of court decisions, merit-based recruitment, asset disclosure, and training for investigators and judges, for example, in financial investigation and asset recovery. A great deal of public expenditures are dispersed through public procurement systems in the procurement of goods, works, and services. This is an area where corruption risk is known to be very high and where actually there is some very promising results and work happening thanks to the adoption of electronic procurement systems. We're now in a space where we're able to use data-driven approaches to identifying risks and addressing risks in real time. And we are broadening our use of digital technologies in anti-corruption, not just in electronic procurement systems, but to innovate in the use of AI and artificial intelligence to identify risks across public administration using administrative data, open data, and also microdata, so transactional data as well. And lastly, the last pillar, coalitions for reform. Making progress in anti-corruption in any setting is very difficult, if not impossible to do, without having effective coalitions in place. And that can be collective action with the private sector or working with civil society. We're helping in some countries build up civil society observatories to build data literacy amongst oversight organizations. Lastly, I'm going to share with you just some examples of the practical advice that's available from World Bank publications. I've lost the slide, but if it comes back again, that was my mistake. There are resources for policymakers, for legislators, for practitioners that touch on all of these different areas that I've talked about. And these are very recent publications from the World Bank, which I recommend for anyone who's interested in a deep dive into any of these technical areas. Taxing crime, a whole-of-government approach to fighting corruption, money laundering, and tax crime. I mentioned the link between financial crime and tax administration is a really important emerging area in anti-corruption. Unexplained wealth orders. That's quite a groundbreaking policy that is intended to help prevent kleptocrats from hiding their wealth in luxury properties around the world. There's a guide for policymakers on the role of unexplained wealth orders in asset recovery frameworks. And there's also a publication with case studies on what we see as effective approaches to addressing corruption across the whole of government, so in different sectors. And a good practices guide on preventing and managing conflicts of interest in the public sector. This is a sample of the sorts of resources that are available to policymakers to help in the drafting of regulations. On this last example on preventing and managing conflicts of interest, something else that we do at the World Bank is to recommend very strongly, and we can support in that effort, that countries undertake surveys of what conflict of interest practices are actually occurring in their country. It is different in every setting, and the regulations should be tailored to address the problem locally. I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to the discussion and to any further questions on how the World Bank is working to fight corruption. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexandra, for a very interesting presentation. I have to comment that whistleblowers is a must legislation for every country if we really mean it to fight corruption, and it was well said. And also, conflicts, like you said, Alexandra, they are being prolonged because of the corruption. It's a matter of interest. And for us politicians, asset declaration. We have to declare our assets on a yearly basis. Now, our next speaker is Mrs. Mariam Kalstian. Mariam is an anti-corruption specialist, lawyer, currently serving as a member to the Corruption Prevention Commission of the Republic of Armenia, a newly established independent body that implements the country's corruption prevention policies. She previously led the Anti-Corruption Policy Development and Monitoring Department of the Ministry of Justice. She has more than 10 years of experience working in state institutions, from which 8 in anti-corruption sphere. During that period, Mariam was always actively involved in ongoing anti-corruption reforms in Armenia and was coordinating the process of anti-corruption policy development. Dear Mariam, the floor is yours. We are honored to have you.
Distinguished colleagues, it's on? That's fine. Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, let me take this opportunity to welcome all of you to Yerevan and hope you are enjoying your stay here. It is my immense pleasure to be here today, and therefore I would like to take this opportunity to thank the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly and the organizers, especially my Armenian colleagues, for giving me an opportunity to speak about the importance of a comprehensive anti-corruption policy, not only for the economic perspectives, but for the security and peace of our world. It is to mention that our world is facing a new era where the effects of corruption directly affect the peaceful population and, what is more tragic, children. In this new era, transparency, accountability, and support of every individual are the heart of global reforms that we all are aiming at. As you are aware, over the last years, Armenia has passed through democratic transition, politically and institutionally, especially when it comes to fostering good governance, preventing and combating corruption. Back in 2019, when the third and boldest anti-corruption strategy was adopted, one of the demonstrations of the political will was the establishment of the anti-corruption institutional framework, which was composed of different institutions having a mandate to prevent, detect, investigate, and adjudicate corruption. I would like to highlight some of the more notable achievements in the anti-corruption and good governance fields made during previous years. Thus, in 2019, Corruption Prevention Commission was established as an independent preventive body. CPC has quite a large scale of powers. So inter alia, we are inspecting and analyzing declarations, conducting integrity check of candidates, as well as acting judges, prosecutors, investigators. We are following the observance of rules of conduct, the incompatibility requirements, and other restrictions by a number of public officials, and also conducting control over the financial activities of political parties, etc. A specialized law enforcement body, the Anti-Corruption Committee, was also established in 2021. Meanwhile, the main competence of the committee is the organization and implementation of pretrial proceedings of criminal corruption cases. A specialized department in the prosecutor office in charge of conducting prosecutorial control over the investigation of corruption crimes, as well as another department dealing with the cases of civil forfeiture of illegal assets were established under the Prosecutor General's office in 2020. Furthermore, now 3 instances of anti-corruption courts are fully operational. It is also worth mentioning that the integrity of all the officials included in the anti-corruption institutions was checked, and the staff received specialized training. As a representative of the Corruption Prevention Commission, I'm happy to say that for the first time in Armenia's history, an emphasis is made not only on the fight, but first of all on the prevention of corruption and on changing the mindset of people. In this regard, it is to highlight that Armenia has a robust legal framework for asset declarations with a comprehensive coverage of public officials and a broad content of declaration. Now we are obliged to submit not only asset and income declaration, but also interest and expenditure declarations. What is more motivating, in 2023, the new electronic platform for declaration was launched, and our next vision step not only includes strengthening the efficiency of the analysis process through the establishment of automated cross-check and risk-based analysis mechanism, but also it is planned that the integrity check questionnaires, reports of the political parties, gift registry, and online corruption risk assessment tool will also be part of this platform. As you can see, digitalization is a main part of our daily routine, since along with the new challenges, it imparts tremendous benefits. If applied properly and wisely, information technologies can be a great benefit to our lives and will contribute to simplified administration, transparency, and reduction of discretion. Importantly, after 3 years of practical work related to integrity check, we can attest that despite the advisory manner of the CPC's opinion provided to the appointing agencies as a result of checking processes, there are only few cases where persons who have received negative opinions have been appointed or promoted. This comes to show the direct impact of the Commission's work regarding the prevention of corruption through integrity checking process. It shall be also mentioned that in recent years, the legal framework for prevention and managing conflict of interest, including incompatibility rules, gift regulations, was significantly improved. Model Code of Conduct for public officials and its interpretative manual have been adopted, and what is more important, hundreds of public officials and candidates have been trained on integrity issues. In addition, I would like to state that although my presentation is more focused on prevention of corruption, significant steps have been undertaken by Armenia to address the issue of asset recovery, the protection of whistleblowers, and creation of reporting effective mechanisms. Ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, I would like to once more indicate that we need to be very consistent. Even with the best institutional systems and the strongest mechanism in place, we will never succeed without changing the mindset of people up to zero tolerance towards corruption. Therefore, for us, those who work at DCPC, it is crucial and exciting that day by day we are witnessing changes in the behavioral culture of public employees, which comes to prove that we are not working to punish, but to give them a chance to change their way of thinking. We should not forget the final beneficiaries of our fight, the people to whom our efforts should serve. So we should encourage and engage with them on this path to building democratic states. We strongly believe that the reforming path and efforts directed to the fight against corruption will safeguard economic development, security and stability not only within the country, but also throughout the region. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mariam, for sharing your valuable experience in fighting corruption here in Armenia. Our final speaker today is Mr. Konstantin Varchelasvili, the head of the Democratization Department. You see, there are also men who are doing a good job when it comes to fight corruption. Of the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, ODIHR, which is mandated to support the OSCE participating states, among others, in developing rule of law-based democratic institutions, respecting principles of transparency, accountability, equality. The floor is yours, Konstantin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam President, distinguished members of the delegations, excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure to be here. First of all, I would like to thank OSCPA for the kind invitation. It is indeed a privilege. I need to do something with my pen. Okay. It is indeed a privilege for me to be here in Yerevan and to participate in this assembly meeting, to be part of this important discussion, to be able to share some observations as well as to inform about the work of audiors in this respect. I will try to focus on the human dimension aspects of corruption, issues of public integrity, importance of the rule of law and effective democratic institutions, and independent justice as well. As you know, it was after the Second World War when international norms, or human rights-related international norms proliferated. Issues of public integrity, issues of the democracy and rule of law became of concern for the international community. Through the UN treaties, OSCE commitments, regional instruments, states have pledged to each other to respect these values and principles. However, back then, the focus on corruption was not as prominent. And it was in mid of, or maybe second half of 90s of the last century when we started to see the adoption of the international treaties, such as UN Declaration Against Corruption and Bribery, Council of Europe Conventions on Corruption, or UN Convention Against Corruption, and many other. Today, threat to security and stability posed by corruption is recognized internationally by UN, by OSCE commitments, and others. And let me also recall in this respect the Charter for the European Security of 1999, adopted at the OSCE Istanbul Summit, as well as the OSCE Strategy document for the economic and environmental dimension, together with many others, recognizing a great threat to the OSCE's shared values, great threat of corruption to the shared values which generates instability and reaches into many aspects of the security, economic, and human dimensions. States have committed in response to integrate these international standards into their practices, to promote openness, transparency, accountability, and rule of law-based public sector. They pledge to prevent and combat corruption by enhancing good governance and promoting oversight. And I'm quoting here the relevant parts of the document, the Copenhagen document of 1990, Ministerial Council Dublin decision of 2012, Tirana document of 2020, and so on. And although at the level of international organizations, corruption is being addressed regularly, it rarely appears on agenda of a high-level bilateral exchanges. Many participating states do more and more proactively in fight against corruption, but they don't rush to hold each other at account for corruption practices. However, our societies are rapidly changing, and today we live in a world where corrupt practices are universally condemned. Although sometimes the definitions of corruption become questionable. And I believe that corruption becomes and will become an important bilateral issue as well as it is multilateral. Corruption is frequently results from or goes hand in hand with weak governance, a lack of rule of law and transparency, and as well as independent justice. At the same time, it may lead to the weakening of these institutions. These fundamental deficiencies can lead to interstate or intrastate conflicts. And it was mentioned by a number of speakers yesterday that the war in Ukraine, security challenges which many neighboring states are facing as a result of this war, as a result of the invasion of the Russian Federation in Ukraine, conflict in wars in South Caucasus, humanitarian crisis in Nagorno-Karabakh, created unprecedented challenges to the OSCE, which indeed find itself at the crossroad. However, it should also be mentioned that we did not arrive at this crossroad unexpectedly or out of sudden. Democratic backsliding, challenges to rule of law, absence of the checks and balances, shrinking space for civil society, all these signs of deterioration were evident throughout the last decades. As mentioned, OSCE commitments, other international documents provide clear guidance that lack of respect for principles of rule of law and democracy, lack of political pluralism, inclusive political participation, complete disregard of human rights and freedoms could undermine the peace and stability, and not only on the national but international level. In this respect, the war in Ukraine, again, appears as an absolute tragic, horrifying reminder of the importance of these commitments. So what will we do at ODIHR? The dynamic in the region is obviously very diverse in response to the challenges. We see that some of the participating states in response to these extraordinary challenges stepped up democratic reforms with understanding that this would lead to the most stable political environment, or because they believe that this was the only right way to respond to the crisis. And Ukraine, again, gives a good example of that. Of course, we also see negative trends and situations which are not as clear-cut. However, and while being cautious of these trends, we do recognize the increased openness of the states across the OSCE to engage with ODIHR. For instance, on the relevant issues, obviously, on the issues related to public integrity and corruption and so on. For instance, our legislative assistance or work related to public integrity and parliamentary ethics has almost doubled during the last couple of years. Corruption in institutions are always characterized by absence of public integrity standards or weak standards, but also by lack of transparency and oversight and deficient justice system. I came across earlier of the study which was conducted back in the beginning of 2000 by IMF and together with the World Bank, if I remember correctly, and they supported the study of transitional economies, identifying corrupt practices and the influence of so-called oligarchs on the policy formation, ability to change rules of the game to their substantive advantage. IMF commissioned paper identified interesting trend. It particularly found that among the countries that were most corrupted by wealthy interests were partial reformers in both political and economic terms. These countries made some progress in liberalization, in privatization, but were much slower in institution building, in introducing or implementing the reforms, democratic reforms, failed to develop strong judiciary or oversight bodies. Furthermore, political regimes of these states were characterized by the greater concentration of power and limitations on political pluralism. This highlights an importance of the institution building and importance of and signals to the international organizations the type of assistance that they can provide. So what do we do in response to the challenges? As many of you know, and this was mentioned already, ODIHR was established by and mandated by the OSCE participating states to assist them in implementing their human dimension commitments. International obligations with respect to the human rights, rule of law, and so on. And in this respect, states can rely on and do regularly request auditors' assistance and expertise. We work with all three branches of government and also with independent bodies like national human rights institutions, anti-corruption agencies, judicial bodies, offering them comprehensive package of assistance, which includes advice on laws and policies that would make them more inclusive, transparent, accountable, and so on. When offering assistance to participating states, we always try to offer advice which is practical and comprehensive as possible, Where relevant, we rely on the cooperation with OSCE institutions and bodies, as well as our external partners, such as GRECO or Venice Commission, and I'm especially pleased to say that we develop good cooperation with the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly in this respect, and frequently have members of the OSCPA contributing to our work. Throughout the last years of our work, on the issues of public integrity and anti-corruption, which intensified, and in particular we focused both on legal and ethical aspects of corruption, supporting development, evaluation of code of ethics, promoting best practices, learning and sharing examples from other states. As mentioned, also offering legal opinions on those issues. We work in partnerships because we believe that this would make our assistance more practical, effective, and better tailored to meet the needs of the states, and also because we trust that we thus reinforce each other. And this is the right way forward. Okay. Okay, so of course there are some negative trends as well, which I mentioned briefly, and I will not be going into this in more detail. Just to give you a couple of other examples of our assistance, we work on the and in cooperation with the OSCPA, which contributed extensively to our work, and Irina, you may remember yourself your participation both in the boot camp, which was organized for the civil society together with Transparency International, and this is the reason why we focus on the support with the civil society is because we believe that transparency can be best ensured with the participation of and involvement of the civil society. In the same manner, we've participated and supported and cooperated with the OSCPA in developing the commenting on the draft resolution on the role of national parliaments in enhancing participation in civil society, which was adopted in Vancouver recently, and which, among other mandates or advises the special representative to work closely with ODIHR in developing the further guidelines. We work with OSCE as well, and many others. I would not list all the examples of our work. Just maybe at the very end, highlight that we stand ready, of course, to assist the parliaments, continue our assistance in offering the required advice and expertise in the areas of rule of law, integrity, and democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, dear Konstantin. I have to say also that civil society part is very important. It's very important in fighting corruption, and we need to invest and encourage NGOs in order to be our allies in this effort, which is not an easy one. Honourable members, I would like now to open the floor for the debate. We have about 22 speakers. So I thank you in advance for your valuable comments and kindly ask you to limit your intervention to 3 minutes. The first speaker on my list is Mr. Pascal Lecamp from France, and he will be followed by Honourable Percy Dower from Canada. Monsieur Lecamp, s'il vous plaît.
Merci Madame la Présidente. Chers collègues, en 2022, un tiers des pays de l'OSCE ont une note inférieure ou égale à 50 sur l'indice de perception de la corruption. Notre représentante spéciale, Irène Charalambides, a beaucoup de travail devant elle. L'OSCE et chaque État membre doit se saisir de cette problématique et mettre en œuvre un outil adapté. Cette lutte, on peut la mener de différentes manières, par des structures exécutives au sein des parlements, de la société civile et évidemment des tribunaux. Il faudrait que l'OSCE et notre représentante spéciale puissent, par exemple, rassembler les bonnes pratiques, les diffuser pour que les États membres désireux de s'améliorer dans ce domaine puissent en avoir connaissance et choisir les instruments dont ils souhaitent se doter et qu'une coopération parlementaire entre États de l'OSCE soit mise en place. Bien sûr, cela nécessite une sincère volonté politique, sans laquelle ce combat n'a aucune issue. En France, la lutte contre la corruption à tous les niveaux, dans tous les secteurs, est une priorité. La France s'est donnée d'un plan pluriannuel de lutte contre la corruption, ainsi que d'institutions et de procédures destinées à empêcher, poursuivre et punir tout comportement répréhensible. L'Agence française anticorruption nationale, placée sous l'autorité conjointe du ministre de l'économie et du ministre de la Justice, a été créée en 2016 pour exercer des missions en conseil, d'assistance et de contrôle. Elle a pour mission d'aider les personnes, morales ou physiques, à prévenir et à détecter toutes les formes d'atteinte à la probité, faits de corruption, de trafic d'influence, de concussion, de prise illégale d'intérêt, de détournement de fonds publics et de favoritisme. La Haute Autorité pour la transparence de la vie publique est une autre institution indépendante chargée de promouvoir la transparence et l'exemplarité de tous les responsables publics, notamment les membres du gouvernement et leurs collaborateurs, les parlementaires, les exécutifs locaux et les membres des autorités administratives indépendantes, de contrôler la déontologie, d'encadrer le lobbying et de diffuser une culture de l'intégrité. Elle mène également des actions de coopération avec la société civile et des actions à l'international pour faire connaître son action et partager ses bonnes pratiques. Ainsi, chaque parlementaire doit, dans les semaines suivant son élection, lui remettre une déclaration d'intérêt et d'activité qui sera comparée à la fin du mandat à une autre déclaration qui pourrait mettre en évidence d'éventuelles prises d'intérêt illégales. Tous les collègues français ici présents ont eu affaire à cette institution. Ces déclarations sont publiques, publiées sur Internet et consultables en préfecture. Par ailleurs, l'Assemblée nationale s'est dotée d'un déontologue chargé de contrôler l'utilisation de l'argent public, du respect de l'interdiction des emplois familiaux pour les collaborateurs, de prévenir ou de faire cesser les conflits d'intérêts des députés. Il est vital pour notre région que la situation en matière de corruption s'améliore. Et je sais qu'Irène ne ménage pas sa peine et mène ce combat sans relâche. Nous la remercions collectivement ici. C'est dans l'intérêt de tous et de chacun pour un monde meilleur, gage de confiance, de sécurité et de paix en Europe. Je vous remercie.
Merci, Monsieur Le Camp. And the next speaker is Honorable Percy Downey from Canada, and he will be followed by Mrs. Maria Karapetian from Armenia. Thank you. The floor is yours, Mr. Downey.
Thank you, Chair, and I'd like to thank the panel members for the very impressive presentations today. I found them very informative. Colleagues, corruption comes down to one thing: money. Illicit financing, money laundering, and tax evasion are a growing problem that pose a significant threat to security and stability in the OSCE region. The money hidden in tax havens must come back to their home countries. If people can hide money in tax havens to avoid paying taxes with no personal impact, we are not treating everyone the same. The losses incurred by companies from illicit transactions are staggering. In 2018, over 2,300 countries lost a total of $1.5 trillion to financial crime, to bribery, corruption, money laundering, fraud, and cybercrime. I want to emphasize that these are not victimless crimes. Rather, tax evasion and the use of tax havens have a major impact on our society. Reduced tax revenues impact the abilities of governments to address public policy challenges, and they drive up nations' deficits and debt. Furthermore, they place an unfair burden on those who do pay their taxes, causing them to pay more to make up the shortfall. As partners in the OSCE, we owe it to one another and to our own citizens to take actions on these global problems. In 2017, Canada joined like-minded nations in enacting our own Magnitsky Law, named for Russian lawyer Sergei Magnitsky. The law permits Canada to enact a variety of sanctions against corrupt foreign officials, including freezing their assets that they hold in our country. Canada recently passed a law requiring federal regulated corporations to create and maintain a list of their beneficial ownership. My own bill to combat international tax evasion is currently before the Canadian Parliament. Among other measures, this bill would require Canada's Federal Revenue Agency to report all convictions for domestic and overseas tax evasion and to report on the tax gap. Many of our partner countries here today have already implemented this type of legislation. As the OSCE Special Representative on Corruption has suggested, the best plan to end the flow of illicit finances is through close cooperation. We are strongest colleagues when we act together. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dami. And now, Mrs. Maria Karapetian from Armenia, and she will be followed by Mr. Khalil Shnopche from Northern Macedonia.
Thank
Maria.
you very much, Madam Vice President. Dear colleagues, it is such a pleasure to see you all in Armenia. We have dedicated this session to the connection between corruption and threats to security. In this respect, of course, the biggest threat to peace and security is when weapons are sold to corrupt regimes, because these corrupt regimes do not use these weapons for legitimate defense. These corrupt regimes use these weapons to defend their corrupt regimes. Yet, I would like to shift the conversation in a positive key and to talk about how the fight against corruption is actually conducive to peace and security, also similar to how our speakers have highlighted for us today. A corruption-free state and society goes hand in hand with democratic, transparent, accountable institutions, healthy institutions, that is to say, from the army to electoral institutions, from schools to ministries. And this means resilience. Resilience is an important defense shield in our modern societies, especially in an era of hybrid wars that include not only conventional arms, but also information technologies, ideologies, and whatnot. So it is with this understanding that we in Armenia have coupled our aspirations for regional peace in the South Caucasus with a very strong domestic agenda for reforms, including the fight against corruption. And let me highlight this by our budget discussions that are underway in the Parliament of Armenia, like in many other parliaments around the world in these fall months. We compare the numbers of our 2024 budget to the numbers of our 2018 budget. The reason for this being that in 2018 was a turning point for Armenia's democratization. So in 2024, the revenue portion of Armenia's budget will be double the revenue portion of 2018. Capital expenditure for 2024 will be triple the capital expenditure of 2018. Our healthcare budget will be double the healthcare budget of 2018. Our education budget will be more than double the education budget of 2018. How was it possible to double the revenue part of the budget, especially in just a few years? Thanks only to the relentless fight against corruption and a free economy. And we're sure that our path to peace internally and externally in our region lies through building a more resilient, a more democratic Armenia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria, and I want to make a reference that you mentioned what's going on in your country, like I did before. It takes a courage to speak up how you are changing things in your own country. Thank you. And now Mr. Khalil Shnopche from Northern Macedonia, and he will be followed by Mrs. Lynn Ruane from Ireland. Please, Mr. Khalil,
Thank you.
colleague, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair, dear colleagues. One of the simplest definitions of democracy is the law on politics. The law as an expression of a well-organized society, what we have in common as a rule, as a principle. There are no individuals and groups that are more powerful than society. Corruption, beyond being harmful to society and the economy, also represents a threat to national security. This is because different autocrats try to use the want of corruption for their destabilization efforts. So, when you have a corrupt leader of a department in the ministry or in any state agency, you have a kind of vulnerability for the security of that institution. So, we must see the risk of corruption also in terms of national security and not only in the sense of breaking the law or harming the economy. You cannot fight corruption and crime if you have it inside the institutions. We had opportunity to listen to some statistical results from World Bank, followed by some recommendations, but I think that without the accountability and arrest of high officials, there will be no results. From a social point of view, in order to have a sustainable democracy, we need a larger middle class. It is very legitimate to seek to be rich, but not through politics, not through public service. If you want to be rich, try your luck and skill in business. In public sector, you must remain in the middle class. I regret to say that in most countries the situation is not like this. In the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides lays out an explanation for the corruption that marked the beginning of the fall of the superpower, ancient Athens. The plague marked the beginning of corruption in that city. No one was willing to insist on what they thought was good because they believed they would die before that good was accomplished, are the famous words of Thucydides. Even today, man's disobedience to what he believes is good marks the beginning of corruption and decadence. Therefore, first of all, we must engage in the values for which we believe they are good. This should be everyone's effort. Without this, we cannot prevent corruption. Thank you.
Thank you. I marked your reference to Peloponnesian War, and I'm looking forward to being in your country in a week's time, dear colleague. Thank you. And now, Mr. Joe Wilson from USA, the floor is yours for 3 minutes, and he will be followed by Mr. Pavlo Frolov from Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And fellow delegates, again, it's so humbling to be with everyone. It's been inspiring to meet with our fellow parliamentarians, to meet with people that indeed people of America so respect, all the countries here, and want the best for everyone. It's just been so humbling to be here. Thank you for the hospitality, particularly to our Armenian host. With that in mind, Madam President, Russia's murderous invasion of Ukraine is a belief by war criminal Putin that he can shamelessly use corruption as a tool of foreign policy. Through bribes, anonymous money, and disinformation, war criminal Putin promotes an environment of mass murder and instability upon Ukraine, Europe, and the world as he's oppressing the people of Russia itself. In order to win the war for civilization and prevent Russian aggression in the future, we must make our systems less susceptible to foreign corruption, which are actually subverting the democratic freedoms that we have. And I am grateful that we can work together, stemming the corruption. I am the co-chairman of the Counter-Kleptocracy Caucus in the U.S. Congress, which is focused on these ways in a bipartisan way, Democrats and Republicans together, as we last year passed a measure which allows for the transfer of legally recovered Russian oligarch assets to Ukraine for reconstruction. I encourage all of our colleagues to pursue Putin's cronies in their systems and ensure that they pay for their war crimes. It is also, I am grateful to work in a bipartisan manner with colleagues for legislation to confiscate Russian sovereign assets. Russia has approximately $350 billion in frozen sovereign assets in the USA, EU, UK, and Canada, which should be used to repair the destruction which has been caused by the Russian invasion. These assets can be correctly used for the people of Ukraine for its defense and victory against Russia's brutal and unprovoked invasion. As sadly we see a war of dictators with rule of gun invading democracy's rule of law, we must defer deter further aggression by war criminal Putin, the regime in Tehran, and the Chinese Communist Party, which is oppressing the people of Russia, Iran, and China. I yield back.
Thank you so much for your intervention. And now the floor goes to Mr. Pavlo Frollo from Ukraine. Dear colleague, the floor is yours for 3 minutes.
Dear colleagues, I urge you to keep in mind that Ukrainians are paying the ultimate price, their lives, for the values and principles of our organization. The unwavering and robust support from our partners is deeply appreciated and crucial for Ukraine's victory. While much has been accomplished, more still needs to be done. In order to approach the end of the Kremlin's terror regime, we should prioritize the fight against corruption by eliminating various illegal schemes that enable Russia to evade sanctions. Russia has become adept at circumventing sanctions, amassing over 800 long-range missiles poised to continue the genocide against Ukrainians, waiting the cold weather. It's imperative to expand the sanctions coalition, implementing secondary sanctions on those who defy the existing ones. This particular holds true for the energy and financial sector, chips and microelectronics supply. We welcome the US decision to sanction companies that breached the agreed price cap while transporting Russian crude oil. Regrettably, for 18 months, Standing Committee had not been able to adopt the amendment posed by the Rules of Procedure Subcommittee regarding the potential suspension of the delegation rights from a state engaged in military aggression against another OSCE member. Our organization operates strictly in accordance with regulations, with procedures. But if we don't have a will to adopt this amendment, I draw your attention to the greatest diplomatic fraud of the 20th century, the theft by Russia of the USSR's seat in the UN and the UN Security Council. Russia's illegal presence in the UN is indisputable, given that the USSR as a state ceased to exist without changing its name and territorial size. Russia claims it has obtained UN membership and permanent seat in the Security Council as a continuator of the Soviet Union. However, this decision has never been approved in any procedural way. Possible scenarios for canceling Russia's UN membership include the Chinese scenario of 1971, when the UN General Assembly recognized the Republic of China, Taiwan, as a sole representative of the Chinese people, requiring a simple majority vote. Another example is the South African scenario, where the Credential Committee from 1969 to 1984 did not confirm South Africa's credential due to apartheid. To restore justice and hold Russia's leaders accountable for the war and violations of the UN Charter, in alignment with the statute of the International Criminal Court, we need UN Security Council recommendation, but it's currently obstructed by a terrorist country. Thank you.
Thank you, dear colleague. Next speaker is Mr. Mahmoud Farahmad from Norway, and he will be followed by Mrs. Victoria Sparge from USA.
Madam Chair, dear colleagues, I would like to start by thanking our hosts for their hospitality and also thank the panel for their insightful introductions. Madam Chair, international corruption threatens security, and countering it is a strategic necessity. Corruption poses a significant threat to state institutions and security for several reasons. It undermines the rule of law and erodes public trust. It hampers development, prevents the growth of a legal and strong economy. It fuels grievances between citizens and lawmakers, and it creates grounds for groups to exploit the country's assets. Corruption diverts public resources away from their intended purposes and as such undermines social mobility for the citizens. Corruption often leads to a breeding ground for organized crime, money laundering and other illicit activities that threaten national and international security. Terrorism has to be mentioned in this context. It has to be said that the terror organization Hamas that has controlled Gaza for 17 years is probably the best example of the effects of corruption. Their supporters in Iran and Moscow are clear examples of states that are corrupt through and through and use funds acquired through corruption to fuel terrorism and wars. As it was mentioned by the experts here today, corruption may be fought through promotion of transparency and accountability in governments and business practices. Strengthening legal frameworks, enforcing anti-corruption laws, and encouraging citizens to partake can also make a difference. It's important for countries to collaborate and share information to combat corruption globally. OSCE is continuously working with these measures, and they are mentioned in several of our previous declarations. But more must be done. The best way to fight corruption is going after the money. Freezing assets and diverting them to help those impacted by corruption must be an independent goal. As an international anti-corruption court will also be a giant leap towards a more credible international approach in this fight. It would help countries to collaborate and share information more effectively. I would urge us as an institution to continue to be a clear voice in the fight against corruption and for strong institutions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, dear colleague. And now I give the floor to Mrs. Victoria Sparch from USA, and she will be followed by Mr. Stéphane Demilly from France. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you having this conversation because I think it's a very serious issue that not just for developing democracies, but also for established democracies. And I think we probably need to do a better job. There is a lot of democratic backsliding, and if you want to really be effective dealing with corruption, you really need to strengthen democratic institutions within countries, and that's something that's been neglected for a long time. And I think this organization might need to start looking at that and start really paying attention. As I mentioned, there are a lot of different things happening, avoidance of sanctions, including in EU countries that actually committed to that, and that's driven by a lot of perverse incentives and corruption that is happening. So I think this is very important because you cannot fight battles and wars if you don't have a proper system of justice and due processes, and if people can take advantage of it, and there should be some consequences. And it seems like it's not happening as effective. So, we can collaborate here, and I think that might be a good forum for us to have a better discussion how we can strengthen institutions and be more effective at fighting corruption, because that can be destructive for any democratic society, and it could really undermine and only benefit countries with a very bad intention. So I appreciate having that conversation, and our delegations are committed in helping with these initiatives, and I yield back.
Thank you so much for being here, first of all. Many of you have flown great distances in order to come to Armenia, and we do appreciate that you are all here joining us today. The floor now goes to Mr. Stéphane Demilly from France, and he will be followed by Mr. Michael Creed from Ireland. The floor is yours.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Mes chers collègues, la corruption constitue une menace importante pour la sécurité et pour la stabilité internationale. Elle fragilise les démocraties, elle affaiblit les États de droit, elle entrave le développement social et économique de certains pays et elle crée un terrain propice à la criminalité organisée et au terrorisme. Ce phénomène impacte de nombreux pays, grands et petits, riches et pauvres, mais c'est dans les pays en développement qu'il est naturellement le plus destructeur. Les ressources qui devraient être consacrées au développement y sont détournées au détriment des services de base à leur population. C'est un cercle vicieux. Plus les inégalités et les injustices gagnent du terrain, et plus les investisseurs étrangers se découragent. La corruption engendre une crise de confiance de la société à l'égard des institutions et du gouvernement en place, ce qui entraîne toujours une forte instabilité politique et instabilité sociale. Les États membres de l'OSCE ont reconnu que la corruption représentait l'un des principaux obstacles à la stabilité et au développement des pays concernés. Nous devons soutenir les autorités nationales des États membres dans la mise en œuvre des engagements pris dans le cadre du droit international, notamment la Convention des Nations Unies contre la corruption et le plan d'action anti-corruption d'Istanbul de l'OCDE. Notre rôle d'observateur doit permettre de suivre la mise en place de mesures préventives et la pénalisation des formes de corruption les plus répandues, que ce soit d'ailleurs dans le secteur public ou que ce soit dans le secteur privé. Une très forte coopération entre les États est absolument nécessaire afin de détecter ces faits de corruption, de les sanctionner et naturellement de favoriser la restitution des biens et des sommes qui ont été détournés. C'est parfaitement et particulièrement important pour de nombreux pays en développement où de hauts responsables ont parfois détourné des richesses nationales et là où les nouvelles autorités en place ont besoin de ressources pour la reconstruction de la société. Le mot corruption ne doit plus être un tabou dans les milieux officiels. Les efforts de coopération et de transparence seront déterminants pour venir à bout de ce phénomène. La communauté internationale est prête. Nous l'avons vu, que ce soit à la conférence de Monterrey sur le financement du développement ou encore au sommet de Johannesburg pour le développement durable. Les gouvernements ont manifesté leur volonté de combattre la corruption et de sensibiliser le grand public à ses effets dévastateurs. Il est aujourd'hui temps pour un certain nombre de pays de passer des discours aux actes.
Thank you, dear colleague. Now I give the floor to Mr. Dilovoldiev Nodit from Uzbekistan, and he will be followed by Mr. Denis Karas from Belarus. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair, dear colleagues. As already noted, corruption poses a significant threat to security and stability. It undermines democracy, diminishes the rule of law, and erodes confidence of citizens in government institutions. Social and economic development is impeded, investment discouraged, and market distorted in its path. We are grateful to the OSCE institution for the fact that the fight against corruption is always in the spotlight. As a developing country, the fight against corruption in Uzbekistan has become the highest priority direction of state policy. Since 2017, the practice of adopting state anti-corruption programs every 2 years have been introduced. Newly formed anti-corruption agency, the National Anti-Corruption Council, and its territorial councils are fruitfully cooperating with law enforcement agencies and other bodies responsible for the implementation of anti-corruption policy. As a result of this interaction, state anti-corruption programs are being implemented. Uzbekistan's obligations are being fulfilled in accordance with international standards, in particular with the framework of UN Convention Against Corruption and Istanbul Action Plan. The first time in history of Uzbekistan, the practice of preparing a national report of anti-corruption by the agency has been put in practice. This report should be published annually in the media and provides detailed information on the work carried out by the state bodies, civil society, institutions, and the media to combat corruption. In addition, in recent years, a number of reforms have been implemented aimed at ensuring openness, transparency, and accountability of the activities of government bodies, strengthening public control. As a result, the regulatory framework in this area has been radically improved. Another of Uzbekistan positive practices in the area of corruption prevention has been in the introduction of compliance control in all state authorities and enterprises with a state stake. Major reforms have also been carried out in the area of public procurement, which are reflected in the adoption of a new version of the Public Procurement Act, which reflects the inclusion of the agency in the list of supervisory bodies in this area. Furthermore, it's noteworthy to mention that the effectiveness of reforms aimed at combating corruption in Uzbekistan is being recognized by the international community. In conclusion, I would like to say that Uzbekistan is firmly committed to its international obligation in the fight against corruption and is open to any international cooperation in this area. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Nodit. And now the floor goes to Mr. Denis Karas from Belarus, and he will be followed by Mrs. Valérie Boyer from France. Merci.
Уважаемые участники Ассамблеи, борьба с коррупцией является важнейшим приоритетом внутренней политики Республики Беларусь. Ее пагубные последствия заключаются в том, что она размывает такие важнейшие конституционные принципы консолидации нашего общества, как принцип социальной справедливости и равенства всех перед законом. В настоящее время у нас сформирована сбалансированная система борьбы с коррупцией, которая основана на национальной модели развития государства и соответствует базовым международным антикоррупционным стандартам. В сфере борьбы с коррупцией мы следуем таким основополагающим принципам, как обеспечение прозрачности, действий и решений государственных органов, эффективных контрольных и надзорных процедур, а также принципам неотвратимости наказания. В Беларуси на постоянной основе осуществляется комплексное противодействие коррупции, совершенствуется нормативно-правовая база, применяются инструменты предупреждения коррупции. Особое внимание уделяется вопросам профилактического характера, возмещению причиненного вреда, изъятия доходов, полученных преступным путем. Системная работа по противодействию коррупции в Беларуси охватывает все сферы жизнедеятельности государства, а также нацелена на выявление и устранение ее причин и условий. Базовым документом, на основе которого организуется антикоррупционная деятельность в нашей стране, является Закон Республики Беларусь о борьбе с коррупцией. Важное значение для организации системной работы по противодействию коррупции также имеет принятая стратегия борьбы с коррупцией, а механизмом координации работ всех государственных органов являются документы программного характера, разрабатываемые на основе анализа тенденций криминогенной обстановки и результатов надзорной деятельности. Продолжая политику, направленную на повышение социальной ответственности бизнеса и развитие добропорядочных деловых практик, в Беларуси начата разработка еще 2 национальных стандартов. Борьба с коррупцией в Республике Беларусь не кратковременная кампания, а важнейшая государственная задача в деле укрепления независимости и суверенитета нашего государства, обеспечения национальной безопасности. И главный источник успеха в решении данной задачи – крепкая государственная власть, сильная социальная политика, опора на народ и гласность. Спасибо.
Thank you. Thank you, dear colleague. And now the floor goes to Madame Valérie Boyer from France. Madame Boyer, the floor is yours. Votre microphone.
Merci. Pardon. Merci Madame la Présidente, merci mes chers collègues. La corruption sape la démocratie, l'état de droit et le développement. La corruption, effectivement, touche tous les pays, mais représente un obstacle majeur au développement des pays les plus pauvres. La mise en œuvre du plan d'Istanbul de l'OCDE doit être promue efficacement et développée. Pour des pays de l'OCDE et pour d'autres pays, des indices ont été mis en place. Mais permettez-moi d'insister sur 2 points. La première, c'est peut-être de faire en sorte qu'ici, à l'OSCE, nous développions des bonnes pratiques à partager. Vous savez que la France s'est dotée d'un plan pluriannuel de lutte contre la corruption, avec l'Agence française anticorruption qui a été créée en 2016, avec la Haute Autorité de la transparence et de la vie publique qui touche et qui demande au gouvernement, aux membres du gouvernement, à leurs collaborateurs, aux parlementaires et aux membres des autorités indépendantes de déclarer les sources de leurs revenus. Beaucoup d'organismes publics, et notamment le Parlement, se sont dotés de déontologues. Mais je voudrais insister sur d'autres points. On parle souvent d'évasion fiscale, mais il existe aussi d'autres façons de corrompre qui s'appellent aussi le noircissement. Il n'y a pas que le blanchissement, il y a aussi le noircissement, c'est-à-dire le détournement de fonds publics à des fins ou d'aide sociale, à des fins de corruption ou même d'actes beaucoup plus graves, d'actes de terrorisme. Cela, malheureusement, a été décrit pour la France. Et puis, il y a un dernier point qui, pour moi, me semble extrêmement important. Au sein même des pays de l'OSCE, certains pays subissent l'influence d'autres pays de façon extrêmement importante pour des décisions qui peuvent atteindre la vie politique. Cela a été décrit pour la Russie, mais il y a d'autres grandes puissances, comme la Chine, comme ça a été dit, effectivement, qui interviennent très largement dans des prises de décision, ou d'autres pays qui pratiquent ce qu'on appelle la diplomatie du caviar et qui permettent malheureusement à des influences qui ne sont pas en faveur de la démocratie ou du développement de s'installer dans nos pays. Aujourd'hui, il est très important que l'OSCE se dote de ces d'outils partagés pour lutter contre la corruption et probablement aussi d'outils qui fassent en sorte qu'entre pays de l'OSCE, nous ne subissions pas ces influences néfastes qui entravent la démocratie. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Valerie. And now Mrs. Yevgenia Kravchuk from Ukraine. She will be followed by Mr. Stanislav Anastasov from Bulgaria.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As dear colleagues, as Iran mentioned rightfully, it's quite hard to speak about your own country, but I will try and will tell about the way of Ukraine, how we fight corruption. Just in 2 days, it's going to be 10 years of revolution of dignity. When people went to protest against the corrupt government, against the corrupt president who wanted to steal our European future. A lot of young people that stood on Maidan at that days now are in the parliament, in the government, implementing reforms, implementing anti-corruption reforms and implemented the reforms for the judiciary system. And here we are 10 years later, officially a country that is candidate to European Union. We received a green light from the European Commission for the accession negotiations, and we hope for the political decision of the European Council in mid-December. What have we done on this path? We created an independent system of anti-corruption institutions, and we make sure that they are independent. After this session of OSCE, I return to my parliament and we will vote for another legislation to ensure the total independence, for example, of the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. We have a Special Anti-Corruption Court, we have Special Anti-Corruption Bureau, we have Special Anti-Corruption Agency. We are all politically exposed persons until, basically the end of our days, and our families as well, under strict financial monitoring. And we do this first for the people of Ukraine because they need a better future. We do this to ensure the stability in our own country and the democratic institutions. And I think crucial role in this is also freedom of media and the strong NGOs that can report about the corruption cases. And that's also in Ukraine, some of the investigations started after the independent investigations from NGOs or journalists. Also, I think this is the best way to answer this Russian propaganda that they try to spread in your countries as well, that Ukraine is a failed state, Ukraine is a corrupted state, and that they do, I know why, because they want to cut the help that we receive from other countries. And to end my speech and to conclude my speech, during the Revolution of Dignity 10 years ago, I was pregnant at the last month of pregnancy. My daughter, she is the same age of this path, of these reforms. And we do this for the better future of our children. We want our children to live in democratic, free country in European Union. Thank you.
Thank you, dearest Yevgenia. And now the floor goes to Mr. Stanislav Anastasov, and he will be followed by Mrs. Paula Cardozo from Portugal. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Distinguished colleagues, there is no doubt that corruption poses a great danger to our values and our security, especially in the light of the unprovoked Russian military aggression against Ukraine and the sanctions against Putin's regime, and Iran's financing of terrorist organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah, it's of utmost importance to eradicate all premises for corruption in our own countries in the OSCE region. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll give you just 2 examples which show clearly that corruption can cost many lives. The sanctions against Putin's regime must ensure that not a single cent from our economies goes to Russia or Russian companies, because it goes then to the Russian army and private military companies such as Wagner. In my country, right now, members of the Bulgarian parliament are conducting a large-scale EU-wide investigation into the Bulgarian oil refinery Lukoil Neftohim and its operation, which is owned by Lukoil Russia. It looks like the refinery has abused the derogation granted by the European Commission to Bulgaria to process crude oil from Russia to generate huge profits by the price difference between Brent and Urals oil. Putin's regime in the past 10 months only has raked in extra €1 billion for its war chest from the Bulgarian and European citizens, a crime that cannot happen without the participation of high-ranking officials and public servants, which should be brought to court. Sanctions evasion has also contributed to the brutal, unprecedented and horrible terrorist attack against innocent Israeli citizens on October the 7th, because it allowed the terrorists of Hamas to get armed. That's why Israel has the full right to defend itself and to defend the lives and security of its citizens. Distinguished colleagues, we as parliamentarians have the right and the duty to scrutinize our governments and to cooperate internationally so that we can ensure, in a very open coordination, that not a single cent goes to Putin's regime or other terrorist groups such as Hamas and Hezbollah, and then used to kill innocent citizens in Ukraine, Israel, or elsewhere in the world. We should also ensure that every official or civil servant who was involved in activities that led to that is brought to justice. Thank you.
Thank you. And now the floor goes to Mrs. Paula Cardoso from Portugal, and she will be followed by Mr. Nicolas Samcharadze, my friend from Georgia. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Vice President, dear colleagues. In 2022, the IPC highlights show us how corruption and armed conflict fuel each other and threaten peace. This year report points out that corruption diminishes the state's ability to protect its citizens. On the other hand, conflicts create a breeding ground for corruption. In this complex scenario, fighting corruption, promoting transparency, and strengthening institutions are key measures to prevent further conflict and preserve peace. Corruption undermines the ability of governments to protect people and erodes public trust, increasingly leading to the control of security threats. On the other hand, conflict creates opportunities for corruption and subverts governments' efforts to stop it. Even countries with high CPI scores play a role in the threats that corruption poses to global security. Countries in the top-ranked region, Western Europe and the European Union, have been at a standstill for more than a decade or have declined over the past 5 years. Undue influence over decision-making, poor implementation of integrity safeguards and threats to the rule of law continue to undermine the effectiveness of governments. The conclusion is that democracy is in crisis, and one of the main reasons is the discrediting of political systems, parties and leaderships. The discredit began with corruption and gave rise to extremist movements. Criticism of governments for thinking only about their individual interests and not of the common good is increasing. Corruption has undermined democracy and in particular the weakest democratic system in several countries and has increased inequalities and poverty that generates disbelief in representative democracy, leading to phenomena of intolerance, xenophobia and racism, which are the inspiration of today's populist and radical parties. And what must we do? improving knowledge, training and institutional practice on transparency and integrity, prevent and detect risks of corruption in the public sector, engage the private sector in preventing, detecting and prosecuting corruption, ensure a more effective and uniform application of legal mechanisms for the repression of corruption, improve the response time to the judiciary and ensure the adequacy and effectiveness of punishment, and cooperate at the international level in the fight against corruption. This is an effort we all have to make, save democracy, to protect fundamental rights, to promote peace, because our greatest defense against growing conflicts still is and will be democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. And now the floor goes to Nicholas Samchorache from Georgia, and he will be followed by our last speaker for today, Mr. Richard Coles from Latvia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I come from a country which was 20 years ago one of the most corrupt countries in Europe and maybe also in the world. In the last 20 years, Georgia has made a remarkable progress in fighting against corruption. And last year, Georgia made in the top 20 of the countries that are free from corruption in the public sector in a survey made by the World Bank. So that shows an incredible reform that my country has undergone. We have also an enterprise survey which shows that more than 98% of enterprises in Georgia have not had an issue of corruption with the state officials ever. Of course, this is a very good achievement, and notably, the fight against corruption is not an issue on Georgia's European integration, since it is absent from the recommendations. Clearly, the reform phase was a painful one. It required not only legislative changes, but changes to the approach in general towards providing services to the citizens, reform in taxation system, simplifying the taxation system, reform in border management, which were naturally the sources of corruption in the past. With those reforms, I have to also note that the progress that we have in Georgia is unfortunately not shared by our citizens in the occupied territories, because Russia is funding the occupied territories from different funds, some of which may not be very transparent. 80% of the funds in Abkhazia come from Russian budget or non-budgetary organizations. More than 90% of funds in Tkhinvali region also come from Russian budgetary and non-budgetary organizations. So that is a clear demonstration of the fact that dubious financial resources are hindering achievement of peace and stability, and of course are feeding the regimes that are violating international law principles, especially the territorial integrity principle. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicolo. And now the floor goes to Mr. Richard Coles from Latvia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, panelists, as well, for your speeches and deliverables on how to counter the corruption and what threat it poses to democracies and democratic societies. Obviously, there is a lot to be done at the legislators level for our respective countries as well, and I think the number one is transparency. Transparency when it comes to who owns what and where. So with this, obviously, I'm pointing to the area of true beneficiaries. We should ask ourselves, if we look at our legislative framework, do we see that this particular company or this entity or this NGO, that we see the true beneficiary? Can we answer that truly saying, yes, we know who owns what? Then we might be okay. But I think the majority here in this room representing your countries, I think that is the biggest challenge, stumbling block, to reveal the true beneficiaries of companies, entities, and etc. So this is where we need to step up on the improvement of our legislation. Of course, in line with human rights, with privacy rights as well, but obviously corruption should not be hiding behind privacy laws and etc. It has to be exposed. And if we're talking about exposure, obviously what we have heard from previous speakers, the one country that really comes out when it comes on discussions on corruption is Russian Federation. And it should be no surprise to that, because, you know, for years the main commodity or service that Russia exports, it's not crude oil or gas, it's corruption. It's endemic corruption, it's metastasis of corruption. And we should actually look at the trends, what we're seeing even after 24th of February. We see that, well, there is, and I think it's a proof that if you're higher on the index of rule of law, you have less corruption, and it is somewhat a law. And Russia is in 113th place in this corruption index. And what we see, countries, for the past year and a half, the trade volume is on a rise with Russia. And it means, is it obviously with very clear and transparent operations, business operation? I doubt it's not. It's actually countries being involved in bypassing sanctions, circumventing, providing these assistances, and that is a part of corruption. Last point I wanted to make is actually corruption is not only political, it's business corruption, and I would actually argue that we can see corruption in civil society through NGOs, where, you know, they're receiving different funding and echoing different messages that actually are playing into hands of autocratic countries. So the corruption is not just classical business or political, it goes beyond. And last case, what we see, the loudest one, Kamtenener, a prominent German journalist who's been, you know, declining for years on asking, do you receive any funding from Russia? No, now apparently it seems receiving 600,000. And then we look what these journalists, for example, have been writing for years, obviously defending autocratic positions. And I think this is where we have to step up on our national legislation. There is no one recipe medicine at international level to cure this, but at national level that is the place. And I would ask, since I'm the last speaker, sorry, I don't want to abuse too much of this time, I want to actually, for the panelists who gave speech, just to reflect on what they have heard, and if there's something they want to also kind of, you know, propose for the delegations as well to bring back home. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coles. Now, dear colleagues, thank you for your interesting interventions. You obviously covered all areas, and yes, I will ask the panelists to comment on what they have heard from all of us. Before giving the floor to the panelists, I want to say two things, dear colleagues. Do not cover up for the parties, even if you belong to one, and do not cover up for your governments. We have to care about the people. We have to care about our citizens. They are voting for us. We are obliged to them. They are confident that we will fight for them. So let's do it. No cover-ups for parties or for governments. I will give the floor to our panelists for final comments. I will start the other way around, first from Konstantin. Any comments, Konstantin, on what you have heard from my colleagues?
Thank you very Thank you very much, and many thanks for the very interesting reflections and the comments and the feedback. It was.
Please close it.
Oh, sorry. I said thank you very much for giving me the floor, and then of course for all the feedback and the comments which we received. I took a good note of them. They do provide a lot of food of thought for our future work as well. I'll make a couple of observations in response to what I've heard, and maybe also to note that some of the delegations which took the floor represent the countries with which ODIHR works currently or used to work in a recent past, and I will just mention maybe some of the examples of this work, which in a way responds to the discussion which was ongoing. For instance, when speaking about our cooperation with Armenia on political party regulations and the issues related to specifically on the issues related to the influence of the money on politics and oversight of the work of the political parties, that was one of the key areas addressed during the party reform in which we were involved. We engaged there were several stages of this cooperation, engaging first by identifying the deficiencies of existing regulations, facilitating expert exchanges, offering legal opinions to the first draft and to subsequent drafts and so on. And that exemplifies the good practices of engaging from the very start of the reform to address the key issues such as influence of money in politics, with understanding that political parties are, and you also mentioned, Madam Chair, that the importance of political parties themselves to keep up with the very high standards of public integrity. We work with the political parties as well directly, advising them on internal ethical regulations, code of conduct, and in this respect I'm also happy to mention another example of, in this particular case, of my home country, where we engage with the several political parties, helping them to develop the ethical codes, and then these parties being introduced to these to the high standards of and agreeing on the high standards of the ethical conduct, become agents of change, if you wish, within the parliament, pushing for the highest standards in future. Rule of law and independent judiciary was mentioned here, and that's indeed a key, because if we are serious when speaking and trying to address the challenges related to corruption, we need to have an independent judiciary, a referee which could be invited and to deal with and to deliver the judgment. Otherwise, no mechanism will ever be effective. And that is another area we're working with countries like Moldova, Ukraine, and many others.
Yeah.
I'll stop here.
Now you mentioned Moldova, I've been there as well. And they did a vending with the judges, and they fired 90% of the judges. That was a good step for a beginning. Okay, and when it comes to ethical codes, let's not leave any small windows open so we can break the rules. You know, politicians are very creative when it comes in breaking the rules. Mariam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Colleagues, thanks indeed for a very open and interesting discussion we had today. Since Konstantin covered almost every important issue, I will be very brief. As it is obvious from all the interventions, there is a total consensus that corruption, both internal and external, is a direct threat to our democratic values, stability and security. Although we are undertaking anti-corruption measures within our countries, we will never succeed if there is no effective international cooperation. Therefore, I would like to stress the importance of centralizing our efforts to ensure not only the efficiency of the fight against, but also for the security and peaceful future of our countries. Thank you.
Alexandra, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for those really interesting and I will also say inspiring interventions from all of the honourable delegates. We heard a range of messages. I want to take up the delegate from Latvia's invitation to reflect a little bit on what I heard in these interventions. I heard some calls for ending impunity, for prosecuting corruption. Prosecution of corruption is notoriously difficult in contexts where corruption has a strong foothold, and in situations where corruption may be systemic, what we often refer to as state capture, situations of state capture. It's often said that politics is the art of the possible. So our job, the international community, regulators, legislators, policymakers, our job is to make corruption difficult. So we've heard a range of tools and approaches for doing that. It is not just about enforcement, where enforcement is possible. It is also about accountability and transparency. And we heard from all of the national delegates the range of approaches that are being adopted in different countries. I'd also like to reflect, I think, on a really useful strategy that we heard from the delegation from Armenia, which is to emphasize the positives, the outcomes. We heard that the efforts to control corruption in Armenia have resulted in greater revenues. There is more budget to be spent on education and health. And the other thing that we need to focus on, we heard from quite a few of the delegates, is to share best practices. This is something that international organizations like the World Bank can certainly help with, to share the best practices that we have already collected, and the work that we do with other international organizations to collect best practices to share with you. The gentleman from Latvia, and I think he wasn't, there were others who also spoke about the need for transparency and beneficial ownership. If I were to emphasize one policy area and one anti-corruption intervention where I think we can probably make the biggest difference collectively, it would be in the adoption and implementation of beneficial ownership disclosure under the Financial Action Task Force. Those requirements are quite clearly set out for all countries to follow and adopt. What is more difficult is to make sure that the registers are working. So this is my final sort of reflection on what I've heard this morning. If all of the delegations present here today were to commit to enforcing and implementing beneficial ownership disclosure in their countries, I would also ask that they emphasize that those regulations include provision for making sure that those registers are actually working as intended. And this can be done quite effectively through data mining and data analysis. This is something that we're pushing quite heavily at the World Bank. So thank you again for the opportunity to reflect back.
Thank you, Alexandra, Mariam, Konstantin, for being here with us today. Well, in order to make corruption a difficult venture, like Alexandra said, collaboration, we have to work together. We must foster partnerships with international organizations who know better than political parties and governments how to fight corruption. Don't forget civil society. Civil society can do a lot on this area, and we all have to develop mechanisms in order to fight corruption and punishment. Do not forget punishment. You have to pass on the message to everybody that punishment, and if the Attorney General is not doing the job, get rid of him. Now, in conclusion, let us recognize that the fight against corruption is not just a moral imperative, it is a strategic necessity for the maintenance of peace and security. It was well said, some colleagues of mine mentioned terrorism groups. Well done. And this is one of the aspects we have to focus on. As representatives of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, let us unite in our commitment to eliminate corruption and build a future where justice, equality, and peace prevail. We owe it to the citizens of our countries. Now, I want to thank once more the Armenian Parliament for hosting this discussion, to all our members for being here this morning, and also the interpreters who have done an excellent job. Thank you guys and girls over there back at the booths. Now I declare the session 2 of the 2023 autumn meeting closed.